putting that back up there, Megan. So one of the things that, just to give you a little bit of background on me, is I've been a business leader, also a nonprofit leader, and also an academic and a department chair for my entire adult career. So I spent 25 years as a professor and department chair in industrial organizational psychology, trained up over 400 alums who are out there. I don't know if any of you are here, but who are out there, many of them doing similar kinds of work to what I assume is the work that you do. People in talent development and human resources, people in leadership development and data analytics, and all kinds of spaces around that are around human resources, some of them in executive roles in those areas. And so this whole idea of culture, and it has some deep thinking around it. So I want to provide you just some, almost provide us a muse for this conversation. And then let's go talk about it. And I want you to, wherever your brain goes, that we will get smarter together. And so let me drop some things that I think might be interesting as things to pick apart related to this. And I want to, when we talk about culture is such an interesting thing, right? It's a powerful thing. Leaders in our sphere, if you are a business executive yourself or you support them, they talk about this a lot, but I don't know if we always know what we're talking about. So I kind of think it's important. Let's talk about what we're talking about. So one thing that's fascinating to me is the way that organizational development relates to culture. All right. And one of my favorite definitions of organizational development from a guy named Burke is this, and it's really simple. Organizational development is a systematic change in an organization's culture. Okay, a systematic change in an organization's culture, which begs for something. It begs for a definition of culture. You know what I'm saying? So when we're trying to change an organization, we're trying to change its culture. So Rob, what is that? And so what's fascinating about this, and one of my favorite definitions, some of you will be familiar with, is a guy named Edgar Schein, who wrote a book called Leadership and Culture and did some interesting theoretical work in this. Many of you might be familiar with it, but listen to Schein's definition of culture. So as professionals in this area, or as executives who have no connection to human resources, whatsoever, organizational development, I think it's still important for us to understand this. When we talk about changing culture, this is what culture is: a pattern of shared basic assumptions that a group has learned as it solves its problems. You don't have to write down any part of this that's interesting to you. A pattern of shared basic assumptions, because I'm going to say more about this, that a group has learned as it solved its problems of external adaptation. So it's solving problems related to adapting to what's going on outside of the organization, and internal integration. So how do we do this together? So it learns these things as it's solving problems, as we learn this together, that has worked well enough to be considered valid. So we're like, yeah, it's good enough. And it's valid, and therefore it's taught to everybody else. All right, it's taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, to think, to feel, and what to do in relation to our problems of internal things and adapting to our external environment. So it's kind of fascinating that it's something that works well enough. So we get into these patterns, these behavioral patterns, based on it working well enough. And probably when it stops to work well enough is when we start to change things. And so, not to beat this thing till it's really, really dead, but it's like this, even in this moment, Megan had an opportunity and was looking to build culture very quickly. And some of you, I know this, some of you have been participating in Zoom sessions that have been, quite frankly, lame. You know what I mean? Like, we're over it. But I would suggest that maybe if we thought about how to do this more, maybe if we thought about architecting more, we might be able to make it something better. And the great thing about this is why I love this, is the bar is low for doing it better. So with a little bit of intentionality, that's why the rules of engagement are so important. That's why even that icebreaker, for those of you that were on early, is important. And that's why that first conversation, maybe even to open up just a little bit of vulnerability, just a little bit more than we might share otherwise. So that's what culture is about. That definition, the pattern of shared basic assumptions. So those of you that like pictures, can I give a nod? Give me a nod if you like. Give me visuals, Rob. I need to see something, okay? Enough words for the moment. So I'm going to use a really high-tech thing called paper, all right, to do this. And you're having a hard time. I'm going to bring it closer and I'll go in front of my face. So what Schein does is Schein uses the iceberg. Now, icebergs are used for all kinds of, the metaphors used all over the place, but I really do like it as a way to think about culture. So So when it comes to architecting culture and what we're all responsible for, first we have to understand what this thing is. So Shine uses this iceberg. Okay, let me get it just right. So like my blurry screen is gonna, okay, there we go. All right, I'm gonna try to keep it still enough. See, now you gotta work a little harder. Yeah, so it's got artifacts, stated values, and assumptions. Can you see this, Joe Ellen? So give me a nod if you can see it. Just give me, okay, thank you. I'm gonna pull this down, but I want you to see the iceberg. At the very top, you have artifacts, stated values, and assumptions. Everybody got that? Ava, can you give me a nod if you, everything's good? Okay, I'm gonna take it down. All right, artifacts, values, stated values, and assumptions. Here's what's interesting about that graphic, to me anyway. So at the very top of that, you have artifacts. And so what Shine would say is that physical things we experience matter. So, and I know this is a stretch, but I think it's true. The use of Zoom, the structure of it is kind of a physical artifact, even though it's virtual, because it's the physical part of it. Is it how I see you, how I see each of your faces matters. And that affects culture. So we have to think about, so artifacts matter. When we were in buildings, for those of us who still are, and many of us are, you have this, the reality. My dad always said, because he was a university leader, and he said, he always believed that the threshold of a building where you walk in matters, because it says something about what the people who are inside it value. So he says that's important. So Shine says that. Physical things, lighting, chair setups, all these things matter. The second layer down, still above the surface, is what Shine described as stated values. So these are things that we say about ourselves as an organization. It includes mission statements, goals, operational manuals, all of it. Those are really important. They affect culture, okay, but they're still above the surface. The thing about icebergs that's so powerful is that according to Shine's, if he uses this iceberg idea, most of what culture is about, we haven't talked about yet. It's below the surface. So most of it is what he describes as assumptions. And the challenge with assumptions is that they are difficult to, they're below the surface, you know, and sometimes they're really difficult to talk about. And even I thought about this at the beginning. I was like, I don't know, do I call out this, that only 2 of you or 3 of you have your videos on? And I was just hoping that somebody would kind of show their faces. And so I thought, but it's kind of awkward for me to do that. So I thought, I don't know, do I do it? Well, it's a living example of this. And so that assumptions part is something that we almost describe. I love living into this metaphor, this analogy, because it's almost like to really discover those assumptions, you almost need to put on your diving suit, you know, like get ready to breathe at a different level and go figure out what those things are and begin that excavation process and identifying what are the assumptions we have, some of which are really helpful and some of which are not. And what are the things that we might hope change? Now, one of the things about this, just so you know, in our second half of our time together, we're gonna give you some ideas for what it means to create a high stretch and high support, a high people investment culture based on some of the research that's out there. So we're gonna get into some of those things. But the first part, I just wanted to put that out there and begin to think about these assumptions. Now, let me give you an example. Now, some of you are like, I like the pictures are good, Rob. The first words are good, but I need a story. So here's another example is that I'll never forget this. International travel, most of you know, it challenges your assumptions. Like you go to different parts of the world and it's really challenging. And one of the examples, so I spent 8 years in India. So we've done work with a lot of leaders who come from tribal populations there. It's been amazing to do leader development with people from some of the poorest communities in the world. And then them going and getting jobs in some of major corporations that are in Hyderabad, India. It's been just an amazing thing that's been transformational for us. But if any of you, I don't know if any of you, raise your hand if you've been in India, like raise your virtual Zoom hand. But the thing about India, and this is true, I had the same experience, similar experience in it from a different lens in Cairo, Egypt, similar experience when I was down in the Dominican Republic, in different parts of the world, is this. First of all, when you drive in India, you know, it's based on the British transportation system. So they drive on the other side of the road. So that's just, you know, first of all, wrapping yourself around that anytime you go to a place like that is interesting. The other thing is this, that it is completely within the rules and assumed, even though I asked people there, like, this isn't in the driving manuals, because if you read like they're driving the rules for driving. It looks like our rules, except for it's on the other side of the road. It is completely appropriate and necessary to pass around corners on highways. I mean, just if you've been to a place in the world like this, everyone does it. And then think of all the necessary assumptions. These are not things that are stated values. They're not written down, that it takes for us not to get into car wrecks all the time. One of the other assumptions of driving through Hyderabad, one of the most densely populated cities in the world, is that if your car is in front at all, you have the right of way. And if they didn't follow this rule, everyone would crash. It is unbelievable that they don't crash. The other thing that you know that's true in many parts of the world is that the horn on your car is not to let people know you're mad at them. I mean, you all know, most of you are in the Northwest region somewhere. You honk your horn when you're getting on the Mercer Street entrance to the freeway on I-5, and you're mad. Like, that's what it's communicating. Like, are you kidding me? But when you're in India, it's a barrage of constant horns. And without the horn, everyone else would also crash. So what's interesting is there's a difference between what we say is important, which is still important, but it's that process of getting at what are the assumptions that it takes for us to actually function well as a culture. And even those of you who work with executives is beginning to educate them on how difficult this is and what it means to do that. So I want to give you an example before I get you out into groups. And I love the concept of architecting culture. Do you know what the definition of architecture is? It's the art and technique of designing and building. But it's distinguished from the skills associated with construction. So architecting culture is the art and technique of designing and building culture, which takes some intention. So I want to give you, I'm going to use WiLD Leaders as a muse. We have what's called a cultural charter that every person who joins our organization reads. And so Megan, if you could put just an example, one part of that charter is what we describe as stated values. And this is, now take this in, and remember this, that every person who joins WiLD Leaders reads this list and signs off on it. And just take a look at some of the things that are important to us that we are attempting to live into every day. So a missional connection to what we're doing. Conviction, we describe that as a willingness to lead strong. Forgiveness. And this means that if this is going to be something that doesn't, and by the way, we don't put this on the wall, because this is a living and breathing document that every year we want to revisit and sometimes edit to make sure that we're living into it, but also to say to which one of these things each of us as individuals who are part of our organization do we struggle with, and which ones are most aspirational and exciting for us. I mean, look at some of these things. Fun is on the list. There's emotional maturity. We even have a stated value of fighting well. And do you know why? Because I don't. So I just would tell you, I don't enjoy conflict. I know it's necessary. And I want everyone on our team to know that we will fight for things that are important to us, but we will do that well. And so I show you this because, I mean, we really work hard at trying to, even the word grace is on there, not taking ourselves too seriously and offering grace to others. Being on time is something we actually talked about this as a team the other day. This is an explicit statement of culture. Now, before we get out into groups and talk about this, because what I would love, I'm priming you to talk about, is what are some of the implicit assumptions in your organization, and what might be some of the things that you would like to put on that list and to bring above the surface, and to work hard at continuing to put them above the surface, because that's the challenge as they get buried. We talked the other day, I'm going to tell you some things that are not on that list. So we talked about, as a team, as a leadership team, what are some of the things that are, and if I forget any of these, Claire or Megan, they're a part of our leadership team at WiLD, that are assumptions that are not on that list. And so here's one of them. Here's one of them I wrote down from Mark. We communicate through text. So it actually is later in the document. We do bring up this, but it's a reality. But we also are careful. We have boundaries where we try not to text each other as much as possible on the weekends, unless we have something we're responsible for a client organization. we don't do sessions on our phones. So through COVID, we served about 50 organizations through our system for the leader development. And when we did a ton of virtually architected sessions. We do not do them. We never said that, but we don't do them from our phones. We could. I don't know if it would work very well, but it's been an assumption. Another one. This is what, I don't know, Claire, if you said this, but someone on the team said, we don't complain. We aren't big complainers. And I think also being careful. I think the other thing is this is kind of cool, is that I think we work hard at not complaining about our clients. I mean, quite frankly, it's like sometimes we could, and it's like we try to be careful and be appreciative. And there's things that we need to work on, and maybe they do too. But and then the other thing is this: we think constantly, this was brought up, about what people are looking at. And what I mean by that is, how are people experiencing us? Whether we're in a virtual session or whether we're face to face. Those are just some of the, and I don't know, there are other things that we are attempting to live out, but those are some of those things. So Megan, if we could get out into these breakout groups, and again, you'll be called back in just a minute, but just to share with each other, what are some of the cultural, and Megan has a prompt for this, but think about these assumptions in your organization, also what you might aspire to architect a little differently. Grateful for all those thoughts, some of the things that were coming up in the chat. Just wonderful, wonderful things. And if I think, Claire, we have a copy of our charter that we could share if anybody's interested to see, like, it's kind of interesting to use. If some of you want to see more about that, it does include more than just those stated values. So what's interesting about this whole concept of investing in people is, and I think most of you probably would agree or hope for this, is this hope that we could create cultures where that investment in people is just part of what we do. And then investment in people also connects into the necessity for us to perform well together. Like, we have to, as organizational leaders, we have to also be producing effective environments, but also how does that performance, as you work alongside, are creating a high stretch and high development kind of culture. So what we're going to share with you is, we wrote a paper called The 10 Scientific Truths of Whole and Intentional Leader Development. And basically, it was actually a human resource VP in a corporation who said a couple of years ago, said, hey, Rob, can you do a review and just give me something that's really consumable? And so we made it look graphically kind of approachable, just to give you some insight really quickly. What are the 10 things we know about leader development that sort of contribute to this idea of creating this kind of high investment culture? And so what we're going to do is we're going to do something that's it's called a speed round. All right. And so put on your seatbelts for this, because we're about to fly. And what we're going to do is that we're going to walk through these. Now, Claire, as Megan said, put the document so you can just open up the PDF so you can follow along. And if you want to read later, that's great. But we're going to go through these, and Megan and I are going to go back and forth. And Megan, how long do we get? Like 1 to 2 minutes max. Probably going to go 1 minute on each of these 10 things. All right. Now, this is basically a very quick dive. What do we know about leader development and whole leader development from the last several decades? And by the way, when we say whole person development, the word whole is interesting, because what we mean by that is all of it. Okay? So the reality is that the leaders in our organizations and us, we are people who have very complex lives, where developing leader capacity isn't just our personalities. It isn't just our experiences. It's not just our character. It's not just the people that are around us. It's not just our competencies. It's all of that. And so when we talk about whole, we mean all of it. And even the concept of this, someone was mentioning this in the chat, that so many of the things that came up in assumptions were related to our working together. Mm-hmm. So much of the work is kind of the invisible stuff, in terms of architecting culture. But here's what's fascinating also. It's amazing how many nonprofits that we deal with where it's a no-no to talk about money. And I say that because would any of us deny that our business finances and even our personal finances are affecting the way we're showing up at work? Of course it is. You know what I mean? These things like money and the resourcing in our lives, not just money, but the resourcing matters alongside issues of the heart. So when we say whole, we mean all of it. So when you look at this research, this is just a deep dive into and a quick snapshot. And I think at the end, there's also if you want to dig deeper, there's actually a reference list to get into some of the research around this. So Megan and I are going to go back and forth. Get out your notepad, okay? And then we're going to do an interactive conversation right after this. So get ready to jump into a conversation with in kind of a fun way. And it's also a process, by the way, that some of you might want to implement in your organization as a way to engage people and do something kind of fun. As Stacy, I think, mentioned, like, I want to bring fun into, was it a manufacturing environment, Stacy? I can't remember, but something like that, where you're like, it isn't normal there, and I'm going to do that. Okay, so Megan and I are going to go do this. So you've got the article. Everybody give me a nod. Joellen, can you give me a nod? You got it. Is it Janissa? Like, give me a nod. Okay. Cool name, by the way. Hope I said it right. So you got that. So we're going to walk through this. Take notes on whatever is interesting to you, because what I'd love for you to talk about is which one of these kind of was maybe a little bit provocative for you, and you thought, like, that's interesting. And so you might think, like, what would it take for me to build that into the culture in our organization, or to talk to the leaders in our organization about that? Are you ready to go? We're going to go kind of quickly, and I'm going to kick it off. Megan, are you ready?
Yes, let's go.
Take yourself off mute. Okay, it's kind of a contest. Who can do their part better? There's 10 things. I'm kidding. It's not. No, we don't compete. We don't do All right. So number one, experience is the teacher. So what this means is that for the research in leader development for the past several decades has made one thing very, very clear, is that most of leader development is developed. It happens, leaders develop on the job. Not just on the job, but through experiences. And a lot of the experiences that they've described in that research are, quite frankly, crucible experiences. Very difficult moments that have pushed them to the edge of themselves, sometimes failures, sometimes successes. And I say that because there is one great thing about this season of adversity for many of us. What we tell organizational leaders is this: to the extent that your leaders are stressed, under pressure, pushed to the edge, being required to innovate, have been through failures in this season, the one thing we know is that the possible leader development laboratory is in place in your organization. Does that make sense? It's like that. It's not, because these are hard experiences, but we know so much that that's where leaders learn. So one thing is that experience is the teacher, and it's happening every day. And so thinking about how to leverage that experience as sort of this, to create this developmental, this leadership bench, is one of the big things. So that's number one. Megan, take it away.
Number two is leaders are born and made. So if you're someone who likes to have the conversation, is it nature versus nurture? We would say yes. No. So this is a powerful statement. We know that 30 to 50% of your becoming a leader and your effectiveness as a leader is related to your traits. So your traits are these 5 personality traits that are not likely to change over time. And we know that 30 to 50% of your becoming a leader is related to your traits, some things that are about you. But what's amazing about that is that means that 50 to 80%, 70%, I did the math wrong, 50 to 70% is up for grabs. So you have so much space. There's so much there that you can learn and grow and become the leader that you want to be. 50 to 70% of that is up for grabs. That's amazing. So it's important to understand that a leader's personality isn't likely to change, but to keep an open mind, because leaders are born and made. So that's important to keep in mind.
Awesome. Okay, number 3, answers reduce agility. So one of the things that is sort of a common curse across so many organizations is leaders feeling the necessity for providing answers. And one thing that I want to suggest to you, that in the area of developmental readiness and agility, which Megan's going to talk about in just a moment, that so much of a person's development is occurring through questions, and questions that they don't yet have the answers to. And so often we feel this necessity to prescribe and to mentor the people on our teams or in our organization, as opposed to inviting them into the questions that are difficult, that cause kind of a psychological dissonance where there's like tension for me. And let me give you one example. I had a CEO. We were doing it to the all hands meeting. He's going to launch the WiLD toolkit across his organization. And he said, okay, Rob, before I introduce you on the stage, this was before COVID, he said, I'm going to get up there and I'm going to say, every leader in this room should be developing the leaders around them. And I said to him, can I change your words just a little bit? Are you open to that? And I said this, what if instead you said this? To do this? What if you get on that stage and you said, what would change if every person in this room was developing the leaders around? Do you see the difference? It's this kind of this, everyone needs to or should, as opposed to an invitation, because now everybody in the room's thinking, oh man, that's a question, because everyone has a different inspirational answer to that question. It gets really interesting. What would change? And so I think one of the things that the research would encourage is you can build agility and resilience by beginning to ask questions. And I would say it's hard to do because in so many organizations we're used to prescribing. And so beginning to build that question kind of development culture it can be a really powerful thing in increasing agility.
So thinking drives doing. So along those lines, kind of moving from what Dr. McKenna said, it can be really dangerous to get in too much of a fixed mindset about who we are, or the type of leader that you are, or the type of worker that you are. That having a growth mindset is incredibly powerful. We're holding on to that understanding that if I have the ability to think more about these things and to think about myself and my own growth and development and the change that can happen there. And again, one of those types of questions, what would be different in your organization if every person believed that they had the capacity to learn and change? And sometimes, there's all these tools that can be really helpful in certain ways around personality things, or, a number or a set of letters, or, all these different things, but we can get kind of stuck in a box in that way. And we really want to be careful to not get stuck in boxes, that we want to keep environments of thinking to open up the possibilities. So what would be different in your organization if every person believed that they had the capacity to learn and to change? And sometimes there's things we do that rub against that in the wrong way and actually don't provide space for agility and that thinking to happen. So keeping that open is incredibly important.
Great. Okay, number 5. Keep those notes going. Number 5, leaders are lonely. Here's the reality that when someone moves into a leadership role, a lot of times, you know how this goes. I'm preaching to the choir about this, but it's a lot of times they previously worked with this team, and now they've stepped into a leadership role. And one of the challenges of that role is that by its very nature of stepping out and going first, that puts you in a position where, I think this is what's interesting. So let's take the concept of transparency. The idea of leadership, full transparency, when it's stated in sort of grandiose, kind of hyperbolic, when we use hyperbole to describe that, is way overstated, because you all know this as HR leaders, those of you that are doing that, there are things you know about the people in your organization that you legally can't share. Can I have a nod? So it's like, so the reality, we're all about whole leader development, which is like real leader development, is that there are things that they have to hold in confidence. So the navigating and I'm not saying transparency isn't important, but what I'm saying is that we're responsible for more than that. And when leaders move into that leadership role, it can become very isolating. And so one of the things that we think is so critical, we know it's critical, is the research is just decades of research on how important social support is and how important a leader being strategically surrounded is helping people begin to think about what it means to begin to build a strategic network of support, which is something we do all the time. We can talk more about later, but the thing I would love for you to leave with that is leaders are lonely. Leadership is a very lonely position, but leaders don't have to be if we were more intentional about helping them get surrounded. And oftentimes being surrounded means people outside of their current organizational context. You know what I mean? That's why you all talking to each other is amazing, because you're all able to talk with other people who are like, I got pain points. How can I get some help? So that's number 5.
Number 6, readiness beats potential. So we're seeing this move from talking about high potential to talking about high readiness, high ready people. And so what is that? How do we even know when someone is ready? What is that readiness? So high ready leaders are those who are in a season of readiness to stretch and grow, to learn, and to be learning agile. And of course, it does include things like talent or competence. Those are a part of the equation, but they're not the only thing there. It's really crucial to know if people are in a season of readiness before being put out there. And we actually have, in our toolkit, we have an assessment of readiness inside of the toolkit. That's incredible. This developmental index of where am I right now in this season? What is my readiness like in this season? And it changes, and answers in that aside, like it can change from month to month because our readiness changes, but knowing where people are and finding people who are in that high ready place, who are ready to stretch and grow, that beats potential. That's really the sum of that one.
All right, number 7, whole isn't conventional. What's within convention is more pieced together kinds of ways of thinking about leader development. And I will tell you that doing whole leader development, as we've done it for years, it is a little bit outside of convention, primarily because it can feel a little bit awkward at first. It's a lot safer sometimes to give someone a personality assessment and sort of call that leadership development. And I'm not saying that's not important, or to tell people what their strengths are. But one example of that is, I don't know if you know that the research around that, but strengths are important as one example. But did you know that most executives, according to the research, don't derail because they fail to leverage their strengths? They fail because they don't know their blind spots. Those setbacks occur because of that. So I'm not saying it's not one, it's both of those things that have to be a part of the equation. And sometimes getting into those things can be a little bit awkward. And so that's why the rest of these research-based strategies is important alongside that, and having the courage to step out and say, we're going to look at people as whole people, which, by the way, includes the fact that Rob has let people down. So what do I do with that? Rob has experienced failures where it wasn't just a career setback, where it's, I made a mistake. And so what does it mean to invite people into a possibility where they could actually work through those things and maybe learn from those things, as opposed to dismissing those mistakes from the past?
Development is personal. It says at the beginning of this, we so often want some one size fits all solution to motivate people or to grow people or whatever it is, but it's personal. It's going to look different for different people. We all have our own whole unique stories that we bring, and all of those things matter. They matter. Like Rob mentioned earlier, the way that your finances are, the way you feel about what your social support is like, who are your friends, what's your family like, how do you feel about those things? Do you have a strategic network of support, people who are pouring into you? Do you have people who that you're investing in? Do you know what motivates you? And when you think about those who are around you, do you know what motivates them? The development is personal. It's not a one size fits all. There can't be that approach to this. And I love this. The most important place to begin might be to start by identifying the unique motivators of those within our influence. If we're wanting to develop and influence those around us, what motivates them? Do we know that about the people around us? That's a powerful place to start.
Number 9, purpose precedes execution. So here's what's fascinating. So in my book, Composed, and then there's an assessment we use called the Leading Under Pressure Inventory. Over the years, I've gotten increasingly interested, because of several longitudinal studies we did, on how people show up in high pressure moments. And basically, we identified there were 11 different research-based strategies. And I'm kind of letting the secret sauce out of the box way earlier when you haven't heard the rest of the content. But I'll tell you this, there were 11 strategies that were important for people in terms of showing up their best under pressure. But I also was interested in looking at what was the number 1 strategy for most people. You know what I mean? When we look across the population, thousands of people who we've studied, and the number 1 predictor of a person's capacity to show up their best under pressure was sense of purpose. So what that means practically is that when it says purpose precedes execution, it means you knowing why you are in a specific moment is just as important as anything you do. And so before every session we do with WiLD leaders, before we work with any organization we're supporting, we ask ourselves, we think about that group and we say, why are we here in this moment? We did this at the beginning of today. And so what that means is if you knew why, it actually will help you. It's like it serves like a keel in the middle of a storm, or like an anchor. So everything, Zoom could go down right now, but if there's one thing that you see 3 WiLD leaders, folk like Claire, Megan, and I know, we know why we're here, which will help us to center ourselves. If I'm in a conversation with my son, high pressure conversation with my son, who's a sophomore in college, my other one's a freshman, if I have thought about why I'm his dad before I have that tough conversation, it will help that conversation go better. So that's what that one's about. And finally, Megan, number 10.
And finally, super, super fun. Leading requires sacrifice. but it's a reality. It's so important. This part, the reality is that truth, influence, and change do not happen in a vacuum. And this statement, living my truth, is an easy statement in the time before we begin to lead. It's easy to say that, I'm going to push my truth forward and you can do yours, but you have to hold yours differently when you're responsible for a whole group of people behind you. What do they need? What's their position? Again, what motivates them? How do you need to lead well for all the people that are around you? You're going to have to hold yours, hold who you are, along with everyone else around you. It's different. Leading is different from not leading. And it's important to recognize that, and that leading often requires sacrifice. And this end piece here on the paper, it says whole leader development must include our whole person, our efficacy, power, influence, confidence, and courage, as well as what we may need to sacrifice for those we have been called to serve. So with that, I want to give you 1 minute to think about this. And you don't have to put this in the chat. This is just something for you to think about on your own. And then we're going to do an activity. So again, you don't have to put this in the chat. This is just something for you to hold and to think about. What would it take for you to implement these principles in the culture of your organization? So when you think about these 10 scientific truths, and hopefully you have the PDF pulled up so that you can scroll back through those. You can find it in the chat there. Check that out. What would it take for you to implement these principles in the culture of your organization?